Daniel Cole was not the kind of man who waited for anyone. He ran meetings that started exactly on time. He made decisions fast, moved faster, and had built his entire reputation on the idea that every minute had a price tag. So sitting alone at a corner table in Marcello's, one of the finest restaurants in the city, checking his watch for the fourth time in 11 minutes, felt like a particular kind of humiliation. 7:52 p.m. His date was now 52 minutes late. He picked up his glass of sparkling water, set it back down without drinking, and stared at the door again. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with the comfortable noise of a Friday evening. Couples leaned toward each other over candlelight. A group of friends laughed loudly at the table near the window. A waiter glided past, carrying something that smelled incredible. Everyone in Marcello's seemed to be exactly where they were supposed to be, with exactly who they were supposed to be with. Everyone except Daniel. His younger sister, Sophie, had been the one behind all of this. She'd spent the better part of 3 months talking him into it. "Daniel, you cannot work every single weekend for the rest of your life. Daniel, you're 38 years old and your best friend is your laptop. Daniel, just meet her. One dinner. What is the worst thing that could happen?" He was currently living the answer to that question. Sophie had described her friend from the pottery class she'd recently joined as someone genuine, someone different, someone who had been through real life and come out of it with her warmth still intact. "She's not like the women you usually try to date," Sophie had said, as if that were a selling point, as if everything Daniel had built, his company, his discipline, his carefully ordered life, was something to apologize for rather than admire. He'd agreed anyway. Partly because Sophie had the particular talent of making him feel guilty when he said no to things. Partly because, if he was being completely honest with himself, which he tried to avoid, the apartment he went home to every night had started to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a very expensive, very quiet box. He'd furnished it beautifully and lived in it like a guest. There were no photos on the walls, no clutter on the counters, nothing that suggested anyone actually belonging there. So he'd put on a good shirt, made a reservation, arrived early like he always did, and he'd waited. He'd given her until 8. That was fair. That was more than fair, actually. If she walked through that door right now, he'd still have his evening. They could have dinner, make polite conversation, shake hands at the end, and go their separate ways. He was good at polite conversation. He'd learned it the same way he'd learned everything else, by deciding it was necessary and then practicing until it came naturally. But 8 o'clock came and went, and the door did not open for her. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. He always kept it on silent during meals, a habit his father had drilled into him when he was young. Mealtimes were for people, not phones. It was one of the few lessons from his childhood that had actually stuck. 3 missed calls from an unknown number, several messages, all from the same number, all sent in the last hour and a half. He scrolled through them slowly. Running behind. Emergency came up at work. I'm so sorry. Sent at 6:40. Childcare just fell through. Trying to sort it out. Please don't give up on me yet. Sent at 7:20. I can't find anyone to help. I might have to bring my daughter. I completely understand if you want to reschedule. I wouldn't blame you at all. Sent at 7:35. We're outside, standing on the pavement like idiots. I'm so sorry, Daniel. This is not how I wanted tonight to go. We're going to head home. I'll call tomorrow to apologize properly. Sent 4 minutes ago. Daniel read through the messages twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table and sat back in his chair. She had a daughter. Sophie had not mentioned a daughter. He thought about that for a moment. A single mother. Emergency at work, babysitter canceling at the last minute, standing on a pavement outside a restaurant she hadn't even made it into, sending apology texts to a stranger while managing a child on her hip. That was not a simple evening. That was a small disaster handled completely alone. He found himself thinking about the message she'd sent at 7:35. I completely understand if you want to reschedule. There was something in the wording of it that struck him. Not dramatic, not full of excuses, just straightforward and a little tired. Like someone who was used to things not going to plan and had learned to absorb it quietly. He looked at the door again. He should leave. The sensible thing, the logical thing, the thing the old Daniel would have done without a second thought was to pay for his sparkling water, tip generously, and walk out. He had an early morning tomorrow. He had a report waiting on his desk that needed his attention before Monday. He had a life that ran on precision and routine and had no particular space in it for complications. He was reaching for his jacket when something stopped him. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling, small and quiet and strange, like the first cold drop of rain before a storm arrives. The particular feeling of standing at a fork in a road you didn't know you were walking down. He put his jacket back on the chair. He would wait 5 more minutes. He wasn't entirely sure why. The 5 minutes passed. Daniel was just reaching for his jacket again, this time with real intention, when he heard a small voice beside him. "Excuse me, are you Daniel?" He turned slowly, half expecting a waiter or perhaps someone who had mistaken him for someone else. Instead, he found himself looking down at a little girl. She was tiny, maybe 4 years old, possibly 5, the kind of age where it was hard to tell. She had blonde hair pulled into a lopsided ponytail that someone had tried hard with and nearly managed. She wore a yellow dress with small white flowers on it and a grass stain on the left knee that told a story all on its own. Her shoes were slightly mismatched, one with the Velcro done up neatly, one left flapping open. She was holding a small stuffed rabbit by one ear, dragging it beside her like a lawyer carries a briefcase, with complete confidence and zero apology. But it was her eyes that stopped him completely. They were the most serious eyes he had ever seen on a child. Pale blue, steady, looking up at him with the kind of focused attention that most adults never quite managed. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't fidgeting. She was simply standing there, looking at him, waiting for his answer with enormous patience and dignity. Daniel blinked. "Yes," he said carefully. "I'm Daniel." She nodded once, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "My mummy said to tell you she's very sorry she's late," the girl began, in a serious, measured voice that suggested she had rehearsed this. "She had to stay at work because there was a little boy who got hurt, and she had to make sure he was okay first. And then our babysitter didn't come, and Mummy tried to call you lots of times but you didn't answer. And then we came here, but Mummy said it wasn't polite to bring me inside because this is a grown-up place. But then she was on the phone to Auntie Sophie, and I saw you through the window." She paused there, took a small breath, and looked at him steadily. "You looked sad," she said simply. "So I thought someone should tell you we were here." Daniel stared at her. In 38 years of life, across hundreds of business meetings and negotiations and conversations with some of the sharpest minds in his industry, he could not remember the last time someone had genuinely surprised him. He prided himself on seeing things coming, on reading situations early and preparing accordingly. Surprises were, in his experience, usually just things you hadn't bothered to pay attention to. But this he had not seen coming. "You came in alone?" he asked. She nodded, completely unbothered by this fact. "Mummy doesn't know," she admitted, with the easy honesty of someone who hasn't yet learned to be strategic about confession. "She was talking to Auntie Sophie on the phone. She was very sad. She thought you were going to be cross." "I'm not cross," Daniel said. "I know," the girl said. "You don't look cross. You looked sad before, but now you look surprised." "I am surprised," he agreed. "What's your name?" "Rosie," she said. "Rosie Ellen Hartley. I'm 4 3/4. The 3/4 is important," she added seriously. "Most people forget it." "I won't forget it," Daniel said. Rosie seemed satisfied with this answer. She shifted her rabbit from one hand to the other and glanced around the restaurant with open curiosity, taking in the candles, the white tablecloths, the glittering glasses, the other diners who were now quietly watching this exchange with undisguised interest. "It's very shiny in here," she observed. "It is quite shiny," Daniel agreed. "We don't usually come to shiny places," Rosie told him. "Mummy says they're for special occasions. Is this a special occasion?" Daniel looked at this small, serious, entirely unexpected person standing beside his table with her lopsided ponytail and her one loose Velcro strap and her battered rabbit, and he felt something move in his chest that he didn't have an immediate name for. Something that had been sitting very still for a very long time. "I'm starting to think it might be," he said. Rosie nodded approvingly. Then she looked toward the restaurant entrance, and her expression shifted slightly, the smallest crack in her composure. "We should probably go and find Mummy," she said. "She's going to notice I'm gone in a minute, and she'll worry. Mummy worries quite a lot. She tries not to show it, but I can always tell." "That sounds like something a very observant person would notice," Daniel said. Rosie looked pleased. "Auntie Sophie says I notice everything." "Auntie Sophie seems like a smart woman," Daniel said, standing up from his chair and reaching for his jacket. "She is," Rosie agreed. "She said you were nice. I wanted to check for myself." Daniel paused, with his jacket half on. "And what's the verdict?" Rosie considered him for a moment, with those serious, pale blue eyes, her head tilted slightly to one side, like a small judge weighing evidence. "You're okay," she said finally. "You didn't make a weird face when I came over. Some grown-ups make a weird face when children talk to them, like they don't know what to do with us." "I know what to do with you," Daniel said. "I'm going to take you back to your mum before she calls out a search party." Rosie smiled for the first time. It transformed her whole face, lit it up from somewhere behind her eyes, and Daniel found himself smiling back before he'd even made the decision to. She reached up and took his hand with the complete, uncomplicated trust that only very young children and very old friends extend to people. The kind of trust that isn't given after careful thought, but simply offered, openly, because it hasn't yet learned to be afraid. Daniel looked down at her small hand in his and felt something shift very quietly inside him. They walked together through the restaurant, toward the entrance. Daniel was aware of the other diners watching them, aware of a waiter who caught his eye and smiled knowingly, aware of the strange and slightly dreamlike quality of the moment. 11 minutes ago, he had been calculating the most dignified way to leave an empty table. Now, he was walking hand in hand with a 4 3/4-year-old girl who had marched into a restaurant alone to deliver an apology on her mother's behalf. He pushed open the door. Outside, on the pavement, directly beneath the warm glow of Marcello's entrance light, a woman was pacing. Her back was to them. She had dark, honey-brown hair that she was pushing through with one hand, in obvious agitation, while her other hand pressed a phone to her ear. She was wearing a simple dark green dress that looked like it had been chosen carefully and then slightly forgotten about in the chaos of the evening. Her shoulders were tight with stress. Even from behind, even in the middle of what was clearly a very difficult moment, there was something about her that made Daniel go very still. "Sophie, I know," she was saying, her voice low and strained. I've ruined it completely. I'll call him tomorrow. I'll apologize properly. He probably thinks I'm an absolute disaster, and honestly, he wouldn't be entirely wrong right now. She turned then, perhaps sensing movement, and her eyes dropped immediately to Rosie. The color drained from her face. "Rosie?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Rosie? How did you? She looked up and saw Daniel standing there, and whatever she had been about to say disappeared entirely. There was a long moment where nobody spoke. Rosie, entirely untroubled by the dramatic weight of the situation, leaned slightly against Daniel's leg and looked up at her mother with an expression of calm reasonableness. "I found him, Mummy," she said. "He was sad. I told him you were sorry. He's not cross." The woman on the pavement stared at her daughter. Then she looked at Daniel. Then she closed her eyes very briefly,
the way people do when they are deciding whether to laugh or cry and haven't quite landed on one yet. "I am so sorry," she said. "I am so sorry. She must have slipped away when I was on the phone. I didn't even see her go. I would never have let her go in there alone. She just—" "She's fine," Daniel said. "She's been perfectly fine. She introduced herself very formally and delivered your message with great professionalism." The woman blinked at him. "She did?" Full name, age, and a clarification that the 3/4 is important. Something crossed her face then, a trembling at the corner of her mouth that was fighting very hard against a smile and gradually losing the battle. "I'm Claire," she said finally, her voice still unsteady. "Claire Hartley. And this is apparently the worst first date in recorded history." "Claire," Daniel said, and he put his hand out. "I'm Daniel, and I don't think it's over yet."
Claire looked at his outstretched hand for just a moment too long. It was the kind of pause that happens when someone has spent the last hour preparing themselves for one outcome and is suddenly faced with a completely different one. She had rehearsed the apology on the pavement. She had mentally composed the phone call she was going to make tomorrow morning, the careful, dignified explanation, the gracious acceptance of whatever polite brush-off came back in response. She had already packed tonight away in the drawer in her mind where she kept things that hadn't worked out, quietly closed it, and started moving on. She had not prepared for him to still be standing here. She had not prepared for him to be smiling. She shook his hand. His grip was firm and warm and brief, the handshake of someone who meant what they said without needing to prove it. "You really don't have to do this," she said. "I mean it. Rosie and I can get the bus home. It's genuinely fine. You've already waited nearly an hour, and that's more patience than anyone could reasonably be expected to." "Claire," Daniel said. "Yes? Have you eaten dinner?" She stopped. "What?" "Tonight. Have you and Rosie eaten anything?" She thought about it. There had been a cereal bar in the bottom of her bag that Rosie had eaten somewhere around 6 o'clock. Before that, Claire herself had managed approximately half a cup of cold tea and a biscuit she'd found on the nurse's station counter at around 2 in the afternoon. She had been planning to eat at the restaurant. That had been the plan. "Not really," she admitted. "Then come inside," Daniel said simply. "Both of you. Have dinner. That's all. No pressure, no expectations, just food." Claire looked at him carefully. She had become very good over the years at reading people quickly. It was an occupational requirement. When you worked with frightened children and their even more frightened parents, you learned fast to separate the people who were saying one thing and meaning another from the people who were simply saying what they meant. It was in the eyes, mostly, in the steadiness of them. Daniel Cole had very steady eyes. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." Rosie, who had been following this exchange with the focused attention of someone watching a tennis match, made a small sound of deep satisfaction. "I knew he'd ask," she told her rabbit. They went back inside together. The same waiter who had watched Daniel walk out now watched him walk back in with a woman and a small child, and to his credit, he rearranged his expression into something professional within about half a second. He found them a slightly larger corner table and disappeared briefly, returning with a booster seat that he fitted to Rosie's chair with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Rosie climbed up, settled herself in, and immediately picked up the menu, holding it with both hands and studying it with enormous seriousness, despite the fact that she almost certainly couldn't read most of it. "I can't actually read all the words," she announced without embarrassment. "But I like looking at the pictures. It helps me think about what I might want." "That's a completely reasonable approach to menus," Daniel said. Claire sat across from him and felt the strange, slightly surreal quality of the moment settle around her. 20 minutes ago, she had been standing on a cold pavement, composing apologies in her head. Now she was sitting in one of the nicest restaurants she had ever been inside, with her daughter installed in a booster seat beside her, looking at a menu she was fairly certain had no prices visible, because the kind of people who ate here regularly weren't meant to need to check. I have to ask you something, Claire said. Go ahead. Why did you stay? And I want the honest answer, not the polite one. Daniel considered this for a moment. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately, didn't reach for something smooth and reassuring. He actually thought about it. Honestly, he said, I'm not entirely sure. I read your messages. I was going to leave. I had my jacket in my hand. He paused. And then I didn't leave. And I'm still not completely sure why, except that something about the situation made me want to see what happened next. That's not a very romantic answer, Claire said. You asked for the honest one. She smiled despite herself. Fair enough. The waiter arrived and they ordered. Rosie requested pasta with the sauce in a separate bowl, please, because she liked to be in charge of how much sauce went on, which the waiter noted with complete seriousness, as though this were a perfectly standard and respectable request, which Claire thought was rather good of him. Claire ordered the sea bass. Daniel ordered lamb and asked Rosie very gravely for her recommendation on the bread, which Rosie provided after brief but serious consideration.
The round ones look good, she said, pointing. They look soft. Excellent call, Daniel said. I have good taste, Rosie told him. Mummy says so. Mummy's right, Claire said. And just like that, something loosened. The tension that Claire had been carrying in her shoulders since approximately 4 o'clock that afternoon began, very slowly, to unknot itself. She picked up her water glass and actually tasted what she was drinking for the first time in hours. Sophie didn't tell you about Rosie, did she? Claire said. It wasn't quite a question. She did not, Daniel confirmed. I asked her not to. Claire glanced at her daughter, who was now carefully arranging the salt and pepper shakers into what appeared to be a small family unit. I know how it sounds when you tell someone on a blind date that you come with a child. I've done it before. The conversation changes. People get a certain look on their face, like they're doing a calculation. What kind of calculation? The is this worth the complication calculation, Claire said simply. And I understand it, I do. I'm not angry at people for doing it. It's honest. But I'd rather someone get to know me a little first before they start doing the maths. Daniel nodded slowly. That makes sense. Does it change anything? She asked. Knowing now? He looked at Rosie, who had given the salt shaker what appeared to be a tiny napkin hat, and was now deeply pleased with herself. Then he looked back at Claire. Not in the way you're worried about, he said. Claire held his gaze for a moment, checking the steadiness she'd noticed earlier. Still there. Okay, she said. The food arrived and the evening opened up in the way that good evenings sometimes do, not with a single dramatic moment, but gradually, like a room filling slowly with warm light. Rosie ate her pasta with focused dedication, carefully dipping each piece to her precise preferred level of sauce coverage. She told Daniel about her preschool, about her best friend, whose name was Marigold, which Rosie considered to be the best name she had ever heard, about the caterpillar she had found in the garden last week, and named Professor Wiggles before her mother had gently explained that they couldn't keep him. We had to let him go, Rosie told Daniel solemnly, because he had his own life to live, Mummy said. Your mummy is wise, Daniel said. She's a nurse, Rosie said, in the tone of someone presenting an irrefutable credential. She fixes children. Not exactly, Claire said, smiling. She does, Rosie insisted, looking at Daniel. When children are very sick and very scared, she makes them feel better. She holds their hand, even in the middle of the night. Daniel looked across the table at Claire. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read, something quieter and more considered than she'd expected. Is that what you did tonight? He asked. Before you came here. The emergency. There was a little boy, 7 years old, came in with a bad head injury, fell from a climbing frame at a friend's house. She kept her voice even, professional, the way she'd learned to talk about these things without letting the weight of them show too clearly. He was frightened, and his mum was absolutely beside herself. I couldn't leave him until he was stable and calm. I just couldn't. I wouldn't have wanted you to, Daniel said. She looked at him. I mean it, he said. A little boy needed you. That's not a complication. That's just who you are. Claire was quiet for a moment. She was not by nature someone who cried easily. Years of working in a children's ward had required her to build a certain resilience, a professional composure that she wore like a second skin. But there was something about the straightforwardness of what he'd just said, the complete absence of resentment in it, that got through a gap in that composure she hadn't noticed was there. She looked down at her plate and took a slow breath. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that." "I'm just being accurate," Daniel said. Rosie, who had finished her pasta and was now leaning comfortably against her mother's arm, with the heaviness of a child who has eaten well and is beginning to lose the battle against tiredness, looked up at Daniel with half-closed eyes. "I like you," she announced. "I like you too, Rosie Ellen Hartley," Daniel said. 3/4 and all. Rosie smiled the same smile he'd seen earlier, the one that lit her up from somewhere deep inside, and closed her eyes entirely. Claire stroked her daughter's hair and looked across the table at this man she had met less than an hour ago, this man who had every reasonable excuse to have left and had chosen not to, who had ordered bread based on a 4-year-old's recommendation and listened to stories about Professor Wiggles with genuine attention, and said the exact right thing about a little boy she hadn't been able to leave.
She thought about all the first dates she'd been on that had gone perfectly smoothly and led to absolutely nothing. She thought about this one. "So," she said quietly, careful not to wake Rosie, "tell me about you. Sophie told me almost nothing. She said I'd find out more if I just showed up." "That sounds like Sophie," Daniel said. "It really does," Claire agreed. "So, who are you, Daniel Cole?" He leaned back slightly in his chair, and for the first time all evening, she saw something relax in him, too. Some carefully maintained composure that he wore the way she wore hers. Not as a disguise, but as a habit, a long-practiced default setting that sometimes forgot to switch off. "That," he said, "is going to require more bread." Claire laughed. A real one, unguarded and surprised out of her. The kind she hadn't managed in longer than she could remember. And the evening, which had started as a disaster and survived as an awkward rescue, quietly became something else entirely. Something that felt, despite all the evidence to the contrary, like a beginning. Section 4. Building something real. The morning after Marcello's, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. This was not particularly remarkable. He almost always woke early, had done since his 20s, when building the company had required it, and his body had simply never unlearned the habit. Most mornings, he was at his desk by 6 with a coffee, moving through emails before the rest of the world had properly started its day. He was good at mornings. Mornings were clean and quiet and uncomplicated. But this particular morning, he lay in bed for a while and stared at the ceiling. He was thinking about a lopsided ponytail. He was thinking about the way Claire had laughed, genuinely laughed, near the end of the evening, when he'd said something about the bread. He hadn't even been trying to be funny. It had just come out, and she had laughed, and he had felt the sound of it somewhere in his chest, warm and unexpected, like sunlight coming through a window you'd forgotten was there. He was thinking about Rosie's hand in his as they walked through the restaurant. The uncomplicated trust of it. He picked up his phone from the nightstand. He had Claire's number now, the real one, typed in himself before they'd said goodnight. He looked at it for a moment. He was not, as a rule, someone who second-guessed himself. Decisions were made, actions were taken, results were measured. That was how he operated. That was how he had always operated. He typed,
Last night didn't go at all how either of us planned. I think that might be why I can't stop thinking about it. Would you and Rosie want to do something this weekend? No fancy restaurants. Something more your speed. He read it back twice, sent it before he could edit it into something more careful. Her reply came 18 minutes later. Rosie asked about you this morning before she'd even had breakfast. That's never happened before. We'd like that very much. He smiled at his phone, like a man who had forgotten he knew how. What followed was not a whirlwind romance. It was nothing like the ones Daniel had watched in films or heard described by people at dinner parties. All grand gestures and breathless momentum, and the sense that two people were being swept helplessly toward each other by forces beyond their control. That was not how it went for Daniel and Claire. It went slowly, carefully, with a great deal of patience and more than a little negotiation. Because building something real around the edges of a real life is not a simple thing. And Claire Hartley had learned the hard way to be cautious about what she allowed into the life she and Rosie had built together. Their second meeting was a Sunday afternoon in the park near Claire's flat. Daniel arrived to find Rosie already at the top of a climbing frame, announcing loudly to no one in particular that she was the queen of the entire park, and everyone below her was her loyal subject. Claire was standing at the bottom, with her arms loosely crossed, watching with the relaxed vigilance of a parent who has learned to look calm while internally calculating the exact odds of various disasters. She's been up there for 20 minutes, Claire said, by way of greeting. She comes down for juice and then goes straight back up. I've accepted it. Smart strategy, Daniel said. Queen! Rosie bellowed from above. You came! I did, Daniel called up to her. Should I bow? Rosie considered this seriously. Yes, please, she decided. Daniel bowed. Claire covered her mouth with her hand. Several passing strangers looked mildly confused. They walked, the three of them, along the park paths while Rosie ran ahead and then circled back and then ran ahead again, in the restless orbit that small children maintain around the adults they feel comfortable with.
She collected 3 interesting sticks, a round stone that she declared was magic, and a fallen leaf that she said looked exactly like a dinosaur if you held it the right way, which Daniel agreed it absolutely did. It was the most uncomplicated afternoon Daniel had spent in years. He bought them all ice cream from a van near the park gate. Rosie got strawberry and ate it with the intense concentration of someone diffusing a bomb. Claire got mint chocolate chip, and they sat on a bench in the thin autumn sunshine and talked while Rosie conducted a one-sided conversation with a nearby pigeon about the merits of sharing. "Can I ask you something personal?" Claire said. "Go ahead." "Sophie says you've never really had a serious relationship." She said it carefully, like she was worried I'd read too much into it. But I'd rather just know. Daniel looked at his ice cream for a moment. She's right. Nothing that lasted more than a few months. Nothing that I'd call serious. Why not? It was a direct question. He appreciated that about her, he was realizing. She didn't circle things. Honestly, I think I told myself for a long time that I didn't have room for it. The company needed everything I had, especially in the early years, and then it became habit. A very comfortable, very lonely habit. "Do you regret it?" "I'm starting to," he said, and looked at her sideways. Claire was quiet for a moment, watching Rosie, who had apparently convinced the pigeon to stay put by offering it a small piece of ice cream cone. "I need to tell you something," Claire said. "And I need you to actually hear it, not just say you understand and then find out 6 months from now that you didn't." "Tell me." "Rosie is not a side note," Claire said. "She's not background detail. She is the entire point of everything I do. Every decision I make, every person I let into my life, every risk I take. I take it knowing she's watching and learning from it. She's already lost one person who was supposed to stay. Her father left before she was even born. She doesn't know that yet, not really. She just knows he's not there. But she will know, one day. And I can't let her feel that again." Daniel said nothing. He let her finish. "So if this is something you're trying out," Claire continued, her voice steady but careful, "if it's interesting right now and you're not sure where it's going, that's an honest thing, and I won't be angry at you for it. But I need to know. Because I can protect myself. I've had plenty of practice. But I don't know if I can protect her a second time." The park moved around them. Rosie had abandoned the pigeon and was now spinning slowly in circles with her arms out, watching the sky. "I hear you," Daniel said. "I'm not trying it out." Claire looked at him. "I don't know exactly what this becomes," he said. "I think that's honest, and I think you'd know if I was pretending otherwise. But I know I'm not here because I'm bored or curious or looking for something easy. I'm here because that night at Marcello's was the first time in longer than I can remember that I didn't want an evening to end. And that's not something I take lightly." Claire held his gaze for a long moment, doing the thing he'd noticed she did, reading him carefully, checking the steadiness. "Okay," she said quietly. Rosie spun herself dizzy and collapsed dramatically onto the grass, laughing at the sky. "Okay," Daniel agreed. The months that followed built themselves one ordinary moment at a time. There were dinners at Claire's flat, which was small and warm and covered in evidence of a life fully lived. Rosie's drawings were stuck to the fridge with alphabet magnets. Books were piled on every available surface. There was a basket of odd socks by the radiator that Claire referred to as the unsolved mystery and had apparently given up attempting to resolve. It was the most lived-in place Daniel had ever spent time in, and he found that he liked it more each time he arrived. He learned to navigate Rosie time, which operated on its own entirely separate logic. Plans changed, bedtimes were negotiated, and occasionally lost. Some evenings, Daniel would arrive for dinner with Claire only to find that Rosie had had a difficult day and needed her mother entirely. And Claire would look at him with an apology already forming, and he would say, genuinely, "Don't worry," and mean it, and go home to his empty apartment without resentment. He was surprised to discover how little resentment he felt. He started cooking. This surprised him more than almost anything else. He bought a decent cookbook, watched some videos, catastrophically ruined 2 attempts at pasta sauce, and then, one Saturday morning, produced a respectable vegetable soup from scratch that he brought to Claire's flat in a container, like a man who had always done this sort of thing. Claire tasted it, raised her eyebrows, and said, "Did Sophie help you with this?" She and Daniel had lunch together on a gray Tuesday in November at a small Italian place near his office that they'd been going to since their 20s. Sophie had ordered the same thing she always ordered. Daniel had barely looked at the menu. "You're different," Sophie said, about 10 minutes in. "In what way?" "In the way that you've asked me 0 questions about work since you sat down, which has never happened in the history of our lunches. And you keep doing that thing with your face." "What thing?" "That thing where you almost smile when you're not thinking about it," Sophie said. "It's very unlike you. It's actually quite pleasant. You should try it more often." Daniel looked at his pasta. "I'm going to ask her to marry me," he said. Sophie put down her fork. "Daniel." "I know it's fast. I know how it sounds. I've done the calculation about 15 times and I keep arriving at the same answer." He looked up. "She's it, Sophie. Her and Rosie both. I've never been more certain of anything." Sophie stared at him for a long moment. Her eyes were doing something complicated that she was clearly trying to keep under control. "If you make me cry in this restaurant," she said, "I will never forgive you." "Pull yourself together," Daniel said, but he was smiling. Sophie reached across the table and grabbed his hand briefly, squeezed it hard, and let go. "She's going to say yes," she said firmly. Obviously, she's going to say yes. But Daniel, how are you going to ask? Because it needs to be right. It needs to be completely right. I know, he said. No hotel lobbies, no flash mobs, no skywriting. I wasn't planning on skywriting. I'm just being thorough. Sophie pointed her fork at him. It needs to be her. It needs to feel like her life, not like something out of a magazine. You understand the difference? He did understand the difference. He'd been thinking about it for weeks. He didn't take Claire to a fine restaurant. He didn't book a suite in an expensive hotel, or arrange for a string quartet, or organize anything that required extensive coordination or a significant deposit. He thought about all of those things and discarded them one by one, because none of them were right, and he knew it. They were the gestures of someone trying to impress, and Daniel had stopped trying to impress Claire Hartley somewhere around the 3rd week of knowing her, because he'd realized quite quickly that impressing her was not the point, and never had been. What she valued was simpler than that, and harder. He planned it for a Sunday in late November. He told Claire he wanted to cook dinner at her flat, which was not unusual. He told her it was nothing special, just a quiet evening in, which was a lie, but a necessary one. He spent most of Saturday quietly preparing things in his own kitchen, and arrived at her flat on Sunday afternoon with 2 bags of ingredients and very steady hands. Rosie met him at the door in a striped jumper and 1 sock. "You're here," she announced. "I am," Daniel agreed. "Where's your other sock?" "I don't know," Rosie said, with complete serenity. "I had it earlier." "These things happen," Daniel said. He cooked while Claire bathed Rosie, and went through the Sunday evening routine that he now knew as well as his own habits. The particular negotiation over how many stories constituted a reasonable number of stories. The glass of water that was always requested precisely after the lights went out. The 3-minute grace period before Rosie accepted that the day was actually ending. He heard Claire's voice through the flat, low and warm, reading something with different voices for different characters, and the sound of it while he stood at the stove doing something ordinary felt like the most extraordinary thing in the world. Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas 40 minutes later, supposedly on her way to the bathroom, actually on her way to see what he was doing. "You're making the soup again," she said. "I am." "The good one?" "I hope so." Rosie leaned against the doorframe and watched him for a moment with her serious, pale blue eyes. She did this sometimes, just watched him, and he had learned not to find it unnerving. It was simply how she processed things. She was a person who observed carefully before she spoke, which was, he thought, a genuinely remarkable quality in someone who was 5 years old. "Daniel," she said. "Yes?" "Are you going to stay?" He turned from the stove. Rosie was looking at him with an expression he recognized. He'd seen it on her face the very first night, through a restaurant window, when she'd noticed a man sitting alone at a table and decided to do something about it. That same focused, serious attention. That same quality of seeing things clearly and saying them plainly. "What do you mean by stay?" he asked carefully because she deserved a careful answer. "Like forever stay," Rosie said. "Like how Marigold's daddy stays. He's always there. He fixes things and he reads stories and he's just there." She paused. "I was just wondering if you were going to be like that, because I think I'd like that, if you wanted to." Daniel set down the spoon. He crossed the kitchen and crouched down so he was at her level, and he looked at her very directly the way she always looked at him. "I very much want to," he said, "if your mummy agrees." Rosie considered this with great seriousness. "She'll agree," she said, with the confidence of someone who has done extensive research. "She smiles different when you're here, I noticed." "You notice everything," Daniel said. "I know," said Rosie, entirely without vanity. "Auntie Sophie says it's a gift." Auntie Sophie is right. He looked at her steadily. Can I ask you something, Rosie? She nodded. Would it be all right with you if I stayed? Rosie was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the city went about its evening business, lights coming on in the buildings opposite, the distant sound of traffic, the ordinary world continuing in its ordinary way. Inside the kitchen, something very quiet and very large was happening. Yes, Rosie said finally. You can stay, but you have to remember about the 3/4. I will never forget the 3/4, Daniel promised. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and padded back down the hall to the bathroom as though nothing of great consequence had just occurred. Daniel stood up slowly. He took a long breath, picked up the spoon, went back to the soup. Claire appeared 20 minutes later, having finally achieved bedtime, wearing an old gray cardigan over her dress and looking beautifully, completely herself. She went down eventually, Claire said, coming into the kitchen. I think she was stalling. She kept asking me questions about the solar system, which is extremely unlike her. She stopped and looked at him. Are you all right? You look strange. I'm fine, Daniel said. Sit down. Dinner's nearly ready. I can help. Sit down, Claire. She sat, watching him with mild suspicion as he served the soup, cut the bread, poured 2 glasses of wine, and brought everything to the table with more deliberate care than the situation obviously required. He sat across from her. He looked at her. He had prepared words, actual words, thought through carefully, refined over several weeks because he was someone who believed in being precise about important things. He had a whole considered speech about what she had given him and who he wanted to be and what he was asking for. He forgot all of it. I had a conversation with Rosie just now, he said. Claire's expression shifted. What kind of conversation? She asked me if I was going to stay. Forever stay was the exact phrasing, like Marigold's daddy. Claire went very still. I told her I very much wanted to, Daniel said. If you agreed. He reached into his jacket pocket and put a small box on the table between them. Plain, dark blue, nothing flashy. So I'm asking you to agree, Claire. Not because things are perfect or because the timing is ideal or because everything has gone to plan, because nothing about us has gone to plan from the very first night. I'm asking because you are the steadiest, most genuinely good person I have ever known. Because Rosie is extraordinary and she gets that from you. Because this flat with the odd sock basket and the drawings on the fridge and the ongoing mystery of the mismatched socks is more of a home than anywhere I've ever lived. And because I don't want to stay the night and drive home in the morning anymore. I want to just stay. Claire was looking at the box, then at him, then at the box again. Daniel, she said, I know it's fast. It's not that fast, she said quietly. It feels like the right speed, actually. It feels like exactly the right speed. She reached across the table and opened the box herself, which was, Daniel thought, the most Claire thing she could possibly have done. She looked at the ring, simple and elegant, exactly the kind of thing he'd spent considerable time finding because he'd wanted it to look like her rather than like an idea of her. Yes, she said, simply, clearly, the way she said everything. Yes, he said. Yes, Claire said, and she was smiling, and her eyes were bright, and she looked like someone who had been very sensibly cautious for a very long time and had just decided, completely and without reservation, to stop. He came around the table and she stood up, and he held her in the small kitchen of her small flat, with the soup going cold on the table and the city outside continuing entirely indifferently. And he thought about all the empty, quiet evenings in his large and carefully furnished apartment, and marveled at the distance between that and this. From somewhere down the hall, a small voice called out, Mummy, did he ask? Claire laughed against his shoulder. Were you listening? She called back. A little bit, Rosie admitted, without significant guilt. She said yes, Daniel called down the hall. There was a pause. I knew it, Rosie announced, at considerable volume for 10 o'clock on a Sunday evening. They married in March, on a bright, cold day that couldn't quite decide between winter and spring, which felt appropriate. Sophie was Claire's maid of honor and spent most of the ceremony looking immensely pleased with herself, which everyone agreed she had entirely earned. The venue was simple, a small registry office followed by a lunch at a restaurant that was nice but not intimidating, with mismatched wildflowers on the tables because Claire had chosen them and Claire had good taste. Rosie was the flower girl. She took this responsibility with the full gravity it deserved. She had practiced her walk approximately 47 times in the 2 weeks leading up to the wedding in the hallway of the flat with a basket of dried pasta in place of flowers, because Claire had hidden the real petals to prevent early deployment. On the day itself, she walked down the aisle with absolute precision and total seriousness, scattering petals with the careful deliberation of a person who has rehearsed, and arrived at the front looking enormously satisfied with herself. She stood beside Daniel during the vows and held his hand without being asked. In his vows, Daniel said, I came to Marcello's expecting an evening that would go perfectly according to plan. Instead, I got a missed phone call and a little girl with a lopsided ponytail who walked into a restaurant alone to tell me her mummy was sorry she was late. I got a woman standing on a pavement who called it the worst first date in recorded history. And I got the best night of my life. He looked at Claire. You taught me that the things worth having don't arrive on schedule. They arrive through the wrong door at the wrong time, and they look nothing like what you were expecting, and they are so completely, exactly right that you wonder how you ever considered leaving. In her vows, Claire said, You could have paid your bill and gone home. Every reasonable person would have. Instead, you walked outside and you met us where we were, and you have been doing that every single day since. You meet us where we are. That is the whole thing, Daniel. That is everything. Rosie, who had been listening to all of this with characteristic seriousness, tugged Daniel's hand at the end of the vows and whispered something. He bent down to hear her. Can I call you Daddy now? She asked. Or do I have to wait for a specific moment? Right now is perfect, Daniel whispered back. Rosie nodded, turned back to face the front, slipped her hand back into his. Okay, Daddy, she said quietly. And Daniel, who had built a company from nothing and run it for 15 years and sat in rooms with serious people making serious decisions without ever once losing his composure, had to spend the next 30 seconds looking very hard at a fixed point on the wall above the registrar's head. Sophie, who noticed everything almost as well as Rosie did, handed him a tissue without comment. Years later, when people asked about their story, Claire would tell it simply. She'd say that she'd been late to a blind date because of a little boy with a head injury, that her babysitter had canceled, that she'd stood on a pavement composing apologies and preparing to give up on the whole evening. And then her daughter had walked into a restaurant by herself to find a man she'd spotted through the window looking sad. Daniel would add that he'd been about to leave, that he'd had his jacket in his hand, that the only reason he'd stayed was a feeling he couldn't explain, a small, quiet thing that had told him to wait just 5 more minutes. Rosie, who by then was old enough to roll her eyes at her parents' sentimentality while also secretly loving every word of the story, would say that it was all really quite straightforward. He looked lonely, she'd say with a shrug, and Mummy was lonely, and I just thought they should know about each other. It wasn't a big thing. It was rather a big thing, Daniel would say. Well, Rosie would allow, in the manner of someone making a generous concession. It turned out to be. But it didn't feel big at the time. It just felt like the right thing to do. And that, in the end, was the whole story. A man who nearly left. A woman who nearly didn't show up. A little girl who looked through a window, noticed someone who needed to know they weren't alone, and walked through a door. The worst first date in recorded history. The best thing that ever happened to any of them.